Welcome to the show. Well, tonight, fascinating stuff. Bruce Pascoe lashes out at SBS for daring to ask him if it's a fake Aborigine. But why don't other journalists do the same? Plus, bad for democracy, a Greens senator takes One Nation leader Pauline Hanson to court for saying she could go back to where she came from if she hates things here. Is that really racist? Also tonight, children now saying no to woke books. Makes me wonder if the woke age is finally over. Fascinating graph coming up. Plenty more as well. But first, this is so shameful. Where is the Immigration Minister? Where is Andrew Giles? Where is his boss, Home Affairs Minister Claire O'Neill? Why have they spent all day, yesterday too, hiding from the media? In fact, they're hiding from their responsibilities on what's turning out to be an absolutely disastrous couple of days for the Albanese government. Let me show you again what Giles and O'Neill have caused between them. Apologies if this photo is too graphic, but this is Nanette Simons. She's 73, she's a cancer sufferer, and she and her husband were bashed, allegedly, by a Kuwaiti man that these two ministers had released from detention without proper controls. Now, there are actually two issues here. One is the astonishingly long list of mistakes by these ministers. A list I'm going to go through. Count them. These mistakes that let this man, Majid Jamshidi Dukushakan, go free, allegedly, to bash and to rob. But the second issue today is the cowardice, the refusal of this government to come clean on what happened, the refusal to take any responsibility, the refusal of Prime Minister Anthony Albanese to hold his ministers to account for a gross dereliction of duty and to sack them. And like I say, Giles and O'Neill today in hiding. And Albanese, I can't possibly comment, but it is someone else's fault.
Our thoughts, and I'm sure the thoughts of all Australians, will be with those who've been affected by this. It's inappropriate to comment further given it's in the middle of the investigation by WA Police. Of course, state bail schemes are run by the states by definition.
That was one of Dan Andrews' great no comment excuses. The Deputy Prime Minister's contribution today was even more breathtaking for its chutzpah.
The ministers are doing an excellent job, but clearly, this is now a matter before the West Australian court, so there's a limit to what we can talk about.
These ministers are actually doing a fantastic job. Seriously? Tell that to Nanette Simons, Richard. Is that our government now not owning up, not taking responsibility, not holding incompetent ministers to account? Like I said, it's shameful. But I want to show you why Giles must go, and possibly O'Neill as well as a senior minister. You can't have people this incompetent making such critical decisions. Let me now list their mistakes. Last year, Giles and O'Neill let this Kuwaiti, Majid Jamshidi Dukushakan, out of immigration detention, and that is mistake number one. They did it because the High Court had just ruled the government had to release a Burmese pedophile because it couldn't detain foreigners like him forever if it couldn't send them back home. The government assumed this meant it should also release this Kuwaiti, plus another 148 foreigners, including 7 murderers and 37 rapists and other sex offenders. In fact, there were two mistakes in this. That the government had let this High Court case about the pedophile get this far, and then that it assumed all the others should be freed as well, including the Kuwaiti. The third mistake. The government released all those detainees without having in place proper ways to monitor them all or keep the most dangerous locked up. You might remember the scramble. Giles, as immigration minister, had even skipped 3 meetings in his own office before the release, meetings to work out legal options, and went instead to London and shot a video promoting the voice of all stupid things. But then we were given this fake assurance by the minister.
The use of electronic monitoring devices on individuals to keep the community safe. A curfew on individuals for the purpose, again, of community safety.
The hits keep coming. That turned out to be a load of bull. For one, this Kuwaiti accused of bashing that Perth couple was not wearing an ankle monitor. That's mistake number 4. It gets worse still. This Kuwaiti allegedly breached his curfew twice before this alleged bashing, and yet was still given bail, set free again. So, mistake number 5. In March, yet another cock-up. These charges against the Kuwaiti of breaching his curfew were dropped. Because, oh my goodness me, poor old Giles and O'Neill had issued the wrong visa, so the curfew conditions with it couldn't be enforced. Mistake number 6. And they still hadn't finished. 3 weeks ago, just a couple of days before Nanette Simons was bashed, Dukoshkan, the Kuwaiti, was given bail again on yet another charge. Again, allowed to walk. The government claims it opposed bail. News reports say no, it didn't. Whatever, the government did not try using at least its new legal powers to take this guy back into detention as a menace. How many mistakes now are we up to? Is it 7? All those mistakes are why, allegedly, Nanette Simons was bashed unconscious. So where is Immigration Minister Andrew Giles today? Where is Claire O'Neill? Even if to just come out and say, look, we're terribly sorry, we're really going to do everything in our power and blah, blah, blah. The opposition leader today was right. Sack them. At least sack Giles.
It appears, on the advice that is available to me, the allegation is that this individual has been to court on 3 separate bail applications. Minister Giles is nowhere to be seen. Claire O'Neill is in witness protection. She's not coming out to face the media. It's clear to most Australians, in fact to every Australian, except for Anthony Albanese, that these ministers can't continue in their jobs.
But Albanese today said, no, these incompetents must stay.
They will be continuing in their roles, and Peter Dutton another day, another bit of negativity from Peter Dutton. And
never forget, Giles is also the immigration minister who last year let in a record 550,000 immigrants, net 550,000 in a single year, adding to our housing crisis. And then when he said, whoops, look, I'm going to cut that, he actually managed to add 100,000 more just in February alone. A new monthly record. How much more of this can Australians afford? Why does this immigration minister still have a job? Today, another example of the Albanese government's new socialism, its new plan to spend your money on what it reckons are business winners, but which for some reason businesses won't invest in. Now, most of the government's so-called investments so far under this Future Made in Australia scheme have been in green energy. Today, though, it threw money at a young company trying to build the first ever commercial quantum computer that works without bugs, which has been a big challenge. Albanese is going 50-50 with the Queensland government and handing nearly $1 billion of taxpayers' money to this US-based company, PsiQuantum, set up 9 years ago by 2 Australian academics.
These guys over here are Australians. and the problem has been that Australians have come up with good ideas and they've had to go offshore to get the capital and to get the support from governments to create the jobs here. We're bringing them home. That's what this is about.
I know that Albanese there said support from government, that was all, when actually great inventions usually get support from business. You think Apple, Microsoft, Tesla. And this $1 billion from government is to create just 400 jobs. Although the Prime Minister said the payoff will actually be massive if this quantum computer actually works. Joining me every Tuesday is National Senator Matt Canavan, the former Deputy Prime Minister. Former Resources Minister. I just promoted you. This is my wishful thinking. Matt, if this works, this computer, that's fantastic. But if the government's, but is it really the government's role to invest in businesses? Isn't it really instead to clear the way for businesses to work themselves by cutting taxes, red tape, workplace restrictions?
Well, I suppose the test, Andrew, is, how much do you think politicians know about quantum computing? I wish these 2 Australians the best success, and it'd be fantastic if Australian inventions can crack something as important as quantum computing. But I probably know as much about it as you do, Andrew, and I reckon it's about as much as the Prime Minister does. So politicians shouldn't be making these decisions with, let's face it, money that is not theirs. The Prime Minister stands up and says, we're putting $1 billion. No, you're putting $1 billion in. The Prime Minister's just signing off on your money, on your cheques, and doesn't have any idea what he's doing. I mean, this spending we've seen, this absolute massive cash splash, we're now up to $3 or $4 billion, I think, over the last few weeks. This is the equivalent of trying to inflate a beach ball after you've punctured a couple of holes in it beforehand. Because this government has put massive new taxes on the economy, like their car tax just the other week. They have put massive new red tape on industrial relations and environmental regulations and green tape as well. They have punctured the lungs of our economy, and now they're trying to reinflate them by pumping air back into it. Well, it's not going to work. It would be a much better idea to lower taxes on investments like those into quantum computing, and then let the market work it out. Let the businesses who know what they're doing work it out, rather than wasting your money with no knowledge about what they're doing.
I know. I mean, they're clobbering cement works in the nickel industry. We had a company, Qenos, the biggest maker of plastics here. They're driving them out of business with high energy costs, and then throwing our money at, this might work, bang, another $1 billion. And they still haven't got to the budget where they're going to really unveil in 2 weeks' time this whole Future Made in Australia thing. But back to what I opened with, Matt Canavan, the Prime Minister is saying is not sacking the Immigration Minister, nor the Home Affairs Minister, after the debacle with this detainee they released who allegedly bashed that 73-year-old woman I showed. Look, it's always an easy call for an opposition to demand a sacking. What makes this case stand out?
Well, I think you've outlined it really well, Andrew, the mistakes that have been made here. There should be ministerial accountability, not only just for the justice for victims like we've seen, that poor pensioner over in Western Australia who suffered a terrible attack as a result of these mistakes, but also as a message to the rest of the ministry to shape up or ship out. It's very important. That discipline does help improve performance. It should be a performance-based game. There's nothing personal about this. These two ministers have not performed. They've made massive mistakes that have had huge material consequences for Australians, and they should go. They've clearly met the bar to go. But the Prime Minister here seems to be more interested in the safety of his own ministers than the safety of the Australian people, because now we've seen the mistakes of those ministers actually do real-world harm to an innocent elderly Australian. There has to be consequences here. I just had a quick look at Minister Giles. Sorry, you go, Andrew. You go.
We don't know yet for sure. We can't say there's a direct consequence between the mistake and the injury, because that's for a court to decide. But let us just say...
Sure, fair point. The allegations there are there, though. And there's enough here, there's enough smoke here for these ministers to go. And the sackable offence alone is them just being completely absent and silent from the media. I checked Minister Giles today. He did put a media release out. We have heard from him. He put a media release out championing new cultural sensitivity training for the Australian Public Service. That's what Minister Giles did today. There's an absolute crisis in his portfolio. He put out that today, that this alone should be reason for him to go.
I'm so glad you brought that to my attention, because I've been at the edge of my seat all day wondering how he'd, what he'd say. And that's the very first thing that was at the top of my mind. Cultural sensitivities in the public service. Excellent stuff. Matt, just finally, more signs that Australians are meanwhile doing it tough. High interest rates, high inflation, higher tax rate. Retail sales for the last month showing spending down 0.4% when it was expected to go up. What's needed to ease the squeeze?
Well, unfortunately, now we're seeing the prospect of stagflation rearing its ugly head here, because last week we saw inflation running hot. Now we learn that, in fact, retail sales have been soft. And so we're getting this terrible beast of both high inflation and weak economic conditions. Well, it goes back to what we started talking about, Andrew. There's no magic bullet here.
Yep.
The government should be lowering taxes, lowering red tape to help attract business investment and get the economy going in a way that lifts its productivity. The only way to encourage economic growth and stronger retail sales without fueling inflation is to encourage businesses to become more productive, more efficient. More government spending is only going to fuel inflation. That's what the government's done over the past year. I said last year, their budget last year was the highest spending budget outside the coronavirus response since Kevin Rudd during the GFC. There was already a raging inflation fire going, and the Treasurer last year just put more fuel on it, which we can see now.
Look, I think you're absolutely correct. The government should be concerned to lift all boats, not throw money at one or two shiny ones. Matt Canavan, thank you so much indeed for your time. Well, the Prime Minister was in Alice Springs today after months of reports of more violence there, especially from Aboriginal youths. But he was keener today to talk about the good things since his last visit a year ago.
But just 2 weeks into term 2, here's some of the figures that show. At Breitling Primary School down the road, 40 kids achieved 100% attendance in term 1. One class had 96% attendance for 6 weeks straight. That makes an enormous difference.
Well, that's nice, but Albanese did have to acknowledge and do something about the mayhem and promised another $14 million for more police just for Alice Springs, plus $8 million to improve schools. Joining me is Liberal Senator Karen Little. Karen Little, thank you so much for joining me. The Prime Minister's visit to Alice Springs, good that he went. $14 million extra for police, $8 million for schools. What did you make of it?
Well, it's about time he visited because he can hear the fury that I've been hearing from people living in communities where alcohol restrictions have been lifted, former CDC communities, but in obviously Central Australia, we've got a situation there where, just over 12 months ago, this government actually allowed the legislation to lapse that actually restricted the access to alcohol and then waited around for consultation before it actually took action, despite the fact locals were telling them they must act quicker. And now we're seeing so much money poured into Central Australia specifically, when it's actually poor policy decisions and poor responses and slow responses or no response to the issues that have actually required that kind of spending response.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? There's a lot of really graphic video come out of Alice Springs the last couple of years that's put it in the headlines, and I don't doubt that there's a real problem in Alice Springs, but it's not just Alice Springs. You were recently in Ceduna, South Australia, not far from where I once lived. There's trouble there too. You mentioned CDC's cashless debit card. The government scrapped them. These are cards that stop people on welfare from using the dole to pay for alcohol. What can you report from Ceduna?
Well, I think it's extraordinary that the Minister Rishworth comes out and says, well, there's no evidence that the card actually worked, and yet some 30 plus business owners and locals wrote letters saying this is ridiculous. Australians should not have to live like that. Locals were saying that. People from communities were saying that. There is plenty of evidence that the card actually did have an impact. But you know what's happening? There is so much more money being poured in. There was another 17 million that Minister Rishworth announced last week, pouring money into a problem that they actually helped create. We have to be asking what's being done with the money that's being spent in these areas.
Well, I don't quite get it. I mean, really, I think people have got to look more to ending welfare ghettos out bush where there's never going to be real work and helping more kids transition to jobs where there are jobs, like in big towns and cities. But that's just, I think we're a long way from that. Domestic violence. Look, Karen, I know you've paid particular attention to this. You've been busy with this one. Another terrible day, 2 more deaths. One, the stabbing of a 10-year-old, allegedly by a 7-year-old sister. Another, a young woman, body found dead. Really, it's just dreadful. The Prime Minister's holding a National Cabinet meeting tomorrow to discuss what to do. He did today say one big problem was that Indigenous women were 7 times more likely to be killed in domestic violence. What needs doing?
Well, I think the first thing the Prime Minister should do to hold a mirror up to himself. We have had a commitment, an election commitment some 2 years ago for 500 much needed frontline community service workers. And almost 2 years to the date of the election commitment. There was zero delivered. This is despite the Prime Minister coming out in November and saying, we're taking immediate and practical action. We've delivered on our commitment. He'd delivered zero, zip, nothing. So he needs to take a mirror to himself and ask, what are they doing in rolling out some of the things that are actually in the national plan to prevent violence against women and their children? What are they actually doing to put pressure on the states and territories to deliver on their part of the commitment? It's not enough just to make a big announcement and think, job's done, we've done our bit. It's actually about following through with taxpayers' money and asking those tough questions, not just of the states and territories, but of themselves. Have we deployed the money effectively? Have we deployed it in a timely manner? Because when you talk to the sector, what they're talking about right now, and I've been right around the country doing roundtables for quite some time, talking to the sector, and they say what's happening is the intensity of violence is definitely increasing. And part of that is because drug and alcohol addiction, pornography, they're saying it's also about repeat offenders, some of which is about 75% of reoffending. You don't have to have these huge funded conversations. You just need to talk to the sector and actually deploy the money that you promised you were going to give them quickly and effectively.
Karen Diddle, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
After the break, a shocking development in these protests against Israel involving a university named after one of our most famous and important Jews. Plus, the protests in America's universities are even worse. But why is President Biden too scared to speak out? And then, I mentioned the fall in retail sales for last month, 0.4%. Economist Lee Van Onselen's been on the show a few times, makes a very good point. That's even after the record immigration intake in February, and we still had sales go down that much. We're in real trouble, particularly Australians already here. Oh my goodness. The anti-Israel movement, meanwhile, has got even more obscene. Now students at Melbourne's Monash University, named after one of our greatest and Jewish generals, will occupy part of that campus in what they say is support of Intifada, a name that's been given to terrorist wars against Israeli Jews. I mean, seriously, this is so sick. And it's also derivative. I mean, these students occupying parts of Australian universities now, they're just copying even more extreme anti-Israel protests than American ones. Now, we could laugh at their ignorance, of course.
What would you say is the main goal with tonight's protest?
I think the goal is just showing our support for Palestine. I really don't know. I'm pretty sure they're... Do you know what NYU is doing? About what? About Israel. Why are we protesting here? Palestine will be free! I wish I was more educated. I'm not either.
Now, we could laugh, but these protests are actually unleashing a very ugly anti-Semitism, with Jewish students threatened and blocked from entering their own universities.
Goodbye, Nazis. You're all Nazis. You're literally all Nazis. What's my...
Go back to Poland.
This is what they do. Everybody, look at this. Look at this. I'm a UCLA student. I deserve to go here. We pay tuition. This is our school. And they're not letting me walk in.
Columbia University even stopped one of its own Jewish professors from coming on campus. But against all this, President Joe Biden is saying effectively nothing. He was his press secretary today.
I'm just not going to comment on leadership at colleges and universities, their decisions. That's for them to decide. We've been very clear. Americans have the right to peacefully protest, and we're going to continue to call out any type of hateful rhetoric, any type of potential hateful violence here.
Joining me is Sean Spicer, the first White House spokesman of President Donald Trump. Sean Spicer, thanks for your time. How bad are these protests that seem to be on so many campuses?
It's an interesting word that you're choosing, Andrew, bad. I think culturally it's very bad. The idea that this many Americans have trained their ire on the Jewish people here in America, something that I just didn't really think existed in America to the extent that it does. It's sad. Bad that our universities are this haven of hate, that they lack the control that they should have. So it's interesting when you say the word bad, I go to so many corners of how bad this is society-wise, for the future of America, for our institutions of learning, for our First Amendment and what we're permitting. It conjures up so many various thoughts that are all equally not good for America.
Now, Sean, you've made very clear that you consider these protests to be anti-Jewish. A lot of the protesters will say, we're not anti-Jewish, we're anti-Zionist, or we're anti-Israel, or we're trying to stop the killing of women and children in Gaza. I've seen so many examples of protesters actually being anti-Jewish, actually picking on Jewish students, that whatever the intention is, to me it does seem the effect of these protests is anti-Jewish. How do you see that?
I don't think there's any other way to see it but anti-Jewish. They're very clear in several of their chants that they want folks of Jewish descent to be exiled, to be killed. There's nothing that can be parsed about that. That's wrong. And the idea that you know, the other thing, and I'll credit one of my predecessors, the White House from the Bush administration, Dana Perino, earlier today. She talked about the fact that you never hear these people talk about how they want the hostages released. They're very clear what their position is. They don't equivocate. They're not specific. And again, these folks attacked, unprovoked, folks in Israel. They killed women and children who were innocent. They didn't attack military targets. They took hostage women and children and Americans. And here we are in America right now trying to figure out how we can have our both sides moment for the left, talking about ending a ceasefire. Israel has citizens that are being held hostage. America has citizens that are being held hostage. I cannot believe so many Americans are this stupid and bigoted.
Look, it's been a shock to me as well. What's also very disappointing is why President Joe Biden isn't speaking out against the harassment of Jewish students. I just played his spokesman doing, look, we call out hate, but without specifying exactly what hate in particular, what examples are speaking out on. They're not doing anything about trying to get universities to clear out the people that are harassing students. What's going on? What's causing this standoff from actually having an opinion here?
I'm going to shock you, Andrew. It's about politics. Joe Biden recognizes that the state of Michigan and its 15 electoral votes are critical to what they call his blue wall defense. States like Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, where he needs them to win his reelection. And there's a massive Arab American population in Michigan in particular. And he recognizes that not just that, but young voters that are important to the coalition that he needs are not with him on this issue. So he's equivocating. This is like so many other issues, the border, life, where Joe Biden will say anything he has to right now, despite his previous pronouncements and policies and stands. He's doing whatever it helps politically expedient his political advantage right now for this upcoming election. He knows what's right. He's said it in the past. He's been on both sides of so many different issues. But when it comes to getting reelected, he'll take any position, including one as pathetic as this.
Donald Trump's reaction, he's just tweeted or on Trump social, you know, these protests have got to stop. Wouldn't have happened under him, he says. What do you make of his intervention here?
Well, number one, he's right. When it comes to so many of the things that are happening in the foreign policy arena, people respected, they actually feared Trump. And that's what kept so many things at bay. So he's absolutely right on that. And then in terms of his domestic response, I don't think he would have tolerated this. And I think people know that. And this is the big difference. And we saw this. It goes back to that horrible and fateful withdrawal from Afghanistan that sent a signal domestically and around the world that the U.S. was not the strong partner that so many people had believed it would be. And they acted accordingly. And then domestically here, because of the politics, President Biden can't do anything to upset these young, privileged little brats on college campuses. And so he's afraid to act decisively. This shouldn't be a tough call. Again, there are so many things going on in this country, whether it's the flood of illegal people coming into our southern border or an issue like this, that aren't tough calls. But they are tough if you're going to just cave to the political whims that you need to get reelected and standing firm for what you believe in on principle.
A lack of leadership, full stop. That's what we're looking at here. Sean Spicer, thank you so much for your time.
You bet, sir. See you next week.
After the break, Bruce Pascoe finally speaks out in anger at the one journalist who got to ask him to his face if he was a fake Aborigine. But why have other journalists ignored this? Professor Bruce Pascoe has written a new book and talked for the first time about the only occasion he was asked on TV to tell us why he was Aboriginal when people were calling him a fake. He's angry. Let me first say again, the issue for me is not whether Pascoe, the white guy on the right there, is a fake Aborigine. We're well over that. More important is that so many of our politicians, our cultural institutions, our journalists, the ABC, still insist on pretending he's Aboriginal when his genealogical record shows 100% of English ancestry. But in this book, this new one, Pascoe finally talks about the time SBS presenter Carla Grant, Stan Grant's former wife, asked him to explain his Aboriginal identity on a show where she discussed fake Aborigines.
Bruce, you wrote Dark Emu, a bestseller about Aboriginal society at the time of first contact. How do you identify?
I identify as Yuin and Bonorong and Tasmanian because we can trace family back to those regions. I didn't grow up Aboriginal. My family didn't talk about it.
When you say you're Tasmanian, which nation do you identify with?
We come from the north coast of Tasmania. Following that family line, we're connected to both Melbourne and Adelaide. We've got people who identify as our cousins in both places. It's very controversial in Tasmania, but that's just how it is.
Do other members of your family agree you all have Aboriginal heritage?
Some do, many don't.
Now, Bruce, some Aboriginal people have rejected your claim to be Indigenous. What do you make of that?
The thing those people have in common is they've never talked to me about it, and I'm really always keen to talk about my family.
No, really? I've asked Pascoe a few times to come on the show or give proof of his Aboriginality. He's refused. Joining me is the only reviewer of Pascoe's book I've seen that noted Pascoe's anger with that SBS interview and saw what it revealed. It's Tony Thomas, who's an author, journalist and writer on Quadrant Online. Tony Thomas, thank you so much for joining us. What does Bruce Pascoe say about that disastrous interview?
Well, the whole inside story is in his new book, and he considers it a case of the classic seduction and betrayal by the media. He reckoned that the director of SBS was a friend of his, so he feels doubly betrayed by being lured onto this show, thinking that he was going to have the chance to prove his story and win friends and influence people. He spent 4 hours with the researchers, showing them all his wonderful documents and photographs and so on. And then he claims that the real agenda was set up by the right-wing media that had somehow got SBS into its clutches. And so among the words he uses about this program is that he was devastated. He was subjected to scorn and contempt. He was disillusioned. It was sensationalist. It was divisive. It was Trump-like. And never again would he go on a SBS program like that.
But Tony, here's the thing. You say that he spent he says in his book, he spent 4 hours with the SBS people, showing them documents. I would have thought it'd take 2 minutes to say, look, this is my ancestor who's Aboriginal. There's, I don't know, a birth certificate or a marriage certificate or something, you know, DNA test, whatever. 2 minutes. He didn't actually say on the SBS program, here it is. They didn't say, here it is. Does it actually exist, this evidence?
Well, I'd say no, because the reason that it's very dangerous for him to name any person is that the Aboriginal mobs, as they describe themselves, would immediately know whether this was true or false. And then the second thing is that all he has to do is to produce DNA. DNA nowadays, you just spit in a tube and the next thing in the mail comes a whole list of all your ancestors, where you're from, whether you're Norwegian or whatever. Now, if on that list there's Aboriginal DNA, case proved for Bruce, we all have to go and dress in sackcloth and ashes, apologise and grovel. On the other hand, if this DNA test, which is utterly scientific and you can't object to it, if it shows no DNA, the whole Bruce Pascoe fraud collapses, assuming it is a fraud. So that's why he's always waffling and he's never precise about who these people are. He sometimes suggests some Aboriginal great-grandmother called Sarah Matthews, and she turns out to have arrived in 1868 on the line of Burlington to Fremantle from England. So much for his Aboriginal great-grandmother, who was also supposed to be somehow on a sealing vessel, so she'd been kidnapped by sealers from an Aboriginal community in Tasmania. So every time he does mention anyone specific, it just collapses in a complete shambles.
Yeah, but this is the curious thing, right? So he complains in this book that it's just written, you know, lots and lots of text about how he showed all this stuff to SBS. He doesn't actually say in the book what he showed them to convince that supposedly shows as Aboriginal. This is the weird thing. I mean, I don't get it. But listen, here's the thing that really interests me. Put Pascoe on one side. We know he's not. I know he's not Aboriginal, but he said on that SBS show, most of his family members don't agree as Aboriginal. Tribes that he claims to belong to say he's not Aboriginal. This is the wider question. Why does the ABC still insist he is? Why did Melbourne University say he is? Why is he still a fixture at writers' festivals who claim he's Aboriginal? Why is that?
Because they've waded so deep into the Pascoe narrative that it's too painful now for them to ever backtrack on it. The closest is Melbourne University, that originally was touting him and trumpeting him as the Aboriginal appointment, and now all they say is that he's, quote, writer and farmer. So that's the sort of back down that's starting. But the reputational damage would be catastrophic for the ABC, especially as it's been brainwashing kids. I hate this, literally probably now by 1 million kids, all indoctrinated with the dark emu, young dark emu nonsense. Now, how is the ABC ever going to claw back from that? It would have to correct literally hundreds of items. It would have to rewrite or dispose of dozens, scores of programs and interviews about him, all of which claim that he's Yuin, he's Boonwurrung, he's Tasmanian Aboriginal. And it's the same with Melbourne University. They are absolutely petrified about any shock to their rankings, their international rankings. It's all important to the Vice-Chancellor and the Senate and so on. Now, if it was known that they had been conned for 4 years by an Aboriginal hoaxer, just assuming that that's the case, their reputation internationally would be catastrophically damaged.
Tony Thomas, thank you so much indeed for your time, and people can read the full essay you've done on this on Quadrant Online. Thank you. Such a fascinating phenomenon. After the break, this is pathetic. A Green senator drags Pauline Hanson into court because of her hurt feelings. But also good news. Are we seeing the death of woke? You know, I think it's pathetic when politicians sue other politicians for defamation. I mean, they've got Parliament right there, the freedom to say in it whatever they like to sort things out. So I'm against Deputy Greens leader Mehreen Faruqi suing One Nation leader Pauline Hanson in court today over Hanson's response to this Faruqi post on the death of the Queen. I cannot mourn the leader of a racist empire built on the stolen lives, land and wealth of colonised people. As if it was. Hanson's response, pack your bags and pee off back to Pakistan. Now that travel advice is apparently racist, at least claims Faruqi. I'm joined now by my Tuesday panel, Will Kingston, host of Australiano, a weekly podcast from The Spectator on politics and culture, and Sky News host Danica Di Giorgio, host of Danica and James on Sky News on Sundays at 8 p.m, and host of all these other things too long to mention. Will, I'll leave the ins and outs of this bizarre case to the judge, but in principle, a politician suing a politician for saying something she thinks is mean. What do you make of that?
It's a nonsense. You know, Faruqi is that insufferable kid in the playground who continuously annoys the other kids. And then finally, when the other kids snap back, she goes off and tells the teacher. Look, the bigger concern I have here is that the concept of lawfare, which is now commonplace in the US, seeps into the Australian political discourse. Thank God we don't have elected prosecutors in Australia. I'm speaking to you from New York, where lawfare is commonplace against Donald Trump. My concern would be, given that Australia is downstream of American politics and culture, that we see politicians increasingly use the courts as just a way to drum up publicity, as a way to take out their opponents, as opposed to a way to seek justice.
Yeah, and I think this actually, Danica, an attack on the principle. Politicians are allowed to speak in Parliament without risk of getting sued in order for the truth to come out, right? So they can say any outrageous thing, really, within almost no limits. I think using the courts like this, I know it's for things said outside Parliament, but that cuts across that spirit of let debate be the arbiter.
I completely agree with you, Andrew, and I believe it sets a really dangerous precedent, but it also takes politicians away from doing what we elected them to do because they're so focused on petty rubbish. And the thing is, Andrew, if every politician was to sue another politician for something that they claimed was mean, well, we'd probably have no politicians left because they would go broke being in and out of the courts every time. I just think it's completely self-righteous, petty, attention-seeking behaviour. I'd also argue that these politicians probably cop more flack from members of the public on social media, for example, and what they're going to take everybody to court as soon as they hear something that really upsets and offends them. It's all rubbish. Get on with the job of governing and move on. Grow a spine. It is what it is.
I couldn't agree more. Will, I don't want to get people too excited, but and maybe you're not the right person to ask because you're sitting in New York, woke central. But I'm wondering if we're starting to see the end of woke. I'll give you one sign from America's top 4 papers of the cultural elite. A huge drop in the number of times their stories mention racists, or racism. That's over the past couple of years. Here's another sign, a report in a book trade magazine from the Bologna Book Fair, quoting publishers saying after a number of years where earnest books, especially on weightier topics and feelings, dominated, publishers are on the lookout for fun books, and there's a move away from issue books for all ages. Do you think we're over peak woke?
No, I don't. I think this may be an ebb in proceedings, but unfortunately this will be a Sisyphean struggle for the next 20 or 30 years, Andrew. And the reason it will be is because the progressive or the illiberal left have so effectively taken over the education system and the education institutions. I think the better example is what we're seeing on college campuses from Sydney all the way to Columbia in the US and the UK. They have been so successful in reorienting curriculums. They've been so successful at taking down the concept of objective truth, until we take back control of the education system, until we take back control of curriculums. Unfortunately, the people who are being taught and who are going through college are going to go into the workforce, they're going to go into the media, they're going to go into politics, and you're going to keep having these woke arguments for a long, long time.
Well, Danica, Will just took an enormous fire extinguisher to my tiny spark of hope. What do you think?
Oh, look, Andrew, I really admire that little glimmer of hope I can see in your eyes, that you think that woke could be dying. But I've got to say, I completely agree with Will on this one. Wokeness is not dying, though I will give you credit for this one. The publishing industry has been copying it for some time. I was reading that there was one book that a famous actor put out, Elliot Page, about transitioning. That book was given a $3 million advance. It sold 68,000 copies. It was a complete flunk. It was a shocker. But look, the problem is, Andrew, that cancel culture remains. We saw it with Roald Dahl novels. They had to be rewritten because, you know, Oompa Loompas had to be gender neutral. So woke is not going anywhere. And just one thing I will say, even I saw a video last night, Andrew, you'll like this, of a hairdresser in the United States who says to a client before she goes to cut their hair, "Do you give me permission to touch you?" Now, I don't know what sort of Edward Scissorhand, gardening shearer's realm this woman is living in. I don't know how you do not touch a person when you cut their hair, but that is a prime example of why I'm sorry, Andrew, but wokeness has not gone anywhere.
Well, listen, I'm just going to leave one thing here. Michelle Houellebecq is the most unpolitical, unwoke writer ever, and is France's most famous living novelist too, and I recommend his books. Michelle Houellebecq. I pin my hopes on people like him. But look, to your point, though, I've got to admit, Will, the woke is still with us, programmed into artificial intelligence by the big social media companies to steer our thinking. Show you an amazing example. Google's new Gemini artificial intelligence app was asked by researcher David Rosario to draw a picture of a 17th century physicist. And you might think Isaac Newton or Galileo, but this is what Gemini came up with, and now closed it for tinkering. African physicists, American Indian physicists supposedly from the 17th century, including a couple of women who invented a magnifying glass, and an American Indian who invented the telescope, physicists from the Middle East, a black man in what seems a costume from 17th century Holland, Indian women, a Chinese monk, and finally, 49th out of 49, a white guy looking a little bit like Galileo, one of the real founders of modern physics. What does this tell you, apart from you were right and I'm wrong?
Well, why is it that always the old white guys are always really serious and stern, and all the multicultural figures are always smiling and super happy? So it's odd. It's like they've never seen a microscope before, but you know, at least they're enjoying their jobs. It's ridiculous, Andrew. The fact is, it is a continuous assault on the notion of objective truth. Postmodernism has a lot to answer for. I think the one thing that any sensible person for the years to come has to keep asking is it true? Not does it make us feel good or does it send the right message? We need to keep asking that one fundamental question. Is this true?
Isn't it amazing how that sounds so subversive? Well, at least Danica is, someone of Italian heritage. You'll be glad that Galileo kind of got a mention right at the very end, but really. Will Kingston, Danica DiGiorgio, thank you both for your time. That's it from me. Up next, Sherry Markson. Good night.